So welcome today to the fifth Cambridge Zero Research Symposium. Today's one is on transport, cities and infrastructure. And so thank you very much for joining us today. We've got a great program of speakers for today's session, starting off with Professor David Cebon from the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight. Then we've got Ruchi Choudhary from the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative, Jenna Panter from the MRC Epidemiology Unit, Tamia Nokta from the Department of Engineering, Daniel Ainalis also from the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, Emma Lawlor also from MRC Epidemiology Unit, André Neto-Bradley from the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative, and Jess Forsdyke from the Structures Research Group in Engineering as well. So you can see their presentation titles here. I'm not going to read them all out, but you'll see them as we go through the presentations as well. We also had another presenter who unfortunately can't join us anymore last minute, Maria Paz Gutierrez, but from architecture, but we will ask her if she wants to record her presentation as a follow-on presentation so you can still see what she wanted to present. Then in addition to the live presentations that we have today, we also have 4 pre-recorded presentations from Anil Madhusudanan at the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, Xiaoshang Na also at Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, Jayu Pan from the Architecture Department, and Mahendrini Arichandra from Engineering. And those presentations are already available on our YouTube channel, and they will remain available after today as well. And the presenters of those presentations are also on the call today. So if you've been able to look at their presentations in advance, then please do also ask them questions in the Q&A today, and they'll be able to answer your questions. So that brings me on to the Q&A. So the rules for the Q&A, we've got the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please use that to submit any questions you may have at any time during the presentations. Please address them to the speaker. So because sometimes it happens that people are still asking questions for the previous speaker when we've moved on to the next presentation. So please address your question to the speaker so that we know who it's for. You can upvote questions in the Q&A box if there's a particular question that you would like to see answered, which will bring it to the top of the box. And if we run out of time to answer all the questions live, then there is also the option for the speakers to write, to type the answers in the Q&A box afterwards. So we will be able to get through all your questions. And I should also say that this session is being recorded, and we will share the recording of the session on our YouTube channel afterwards. So just so you're aware of that. Then, as I said, this is the 5th in our series of research symposia. So we've already had 4 on the previous Wednesdays. The first one was on zero carbon energy transformation. Then we had a symposium on health and society, one on resources and production, one on resilient and sustainable futures, and today we're on to transport, cities and infrastructure. Those 4 previous symposia are all available, the recordings of those symposia are all available on our YouTube channel. So please do go to the website at the bottom there and you'll find links to all those recordings if you want to catch up on those. And next week we have our final of this series of research symposia on carbon drawdown and climate repair. So please do also sign up for that, and you'll find the link to register for that one also on that same website. So yeah, and there's a few more events that I've wanted to highlight that are coming up. In particular, next week is a busy week for climate-related events. So we've got our Carbon Drawdown and Climate Repair Research Symposium on Wednesday, 10th of March. Then on the 11th of March is the first in the series of climate change lecture series for this year, which is an annual series, and it's kicking off again next week. And so you can sign up for that as well on the website there, climateseries.com. And on the 12th of March, on Friday, there is the next in the series of energy transitions discussion series. This one will be on the topic of photovoltaics, which I think will be of interest to people as well. If you want to sign up for that one, please email energy@admin.cam.ac.uk. And finally, later in March, as part of the Cambridge Festival, we have several Cambridge Zero events there as well, which you can find out about on the festival.cam website. So please sign up for those as well. And finally, we also, later on this year in May, we have the Climate Expo virtual conference coming up, which is organized as part of the COP26 Universities Network. And that is another opportunity for researchers and students and people from outside university as well to present their work as where it's relevant to the COP26 conference coming up in the autumn. So please do submit your abstracts for that conference, and the deadline for that is also next week on the 10th of March. And then as well, please do also sign up for our mailing list and follow us on Twitter as per usual. But I'll bring all these links up again at the end, and we will also share these links with everyone following today's event so that you don't miss any of that. Right, I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. And then I would like to invite the first speaker of today, Professor David Cebon from the Center for Sustainable Road Freight. David, over to you, and please share your screen. And there we go. Yeah, we can.
Great. You can see that, Eric?
Yeah, we're all good.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here today. Thanks very much for inviting a team from the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight. I'm going to just give an overview about the centre and the program and how we've kind of defined what we do. Daniel is going to follow a little later on with one research project which looks at the long term for sustainable road freight. And Anil and Xiaozhang have each got projects which refer to short and medium term. So we've got kind of an overview, an example of a short term, a medium term, and a longer term project. Now the centre has 3 universities, Cambridge, Heriot-Watt, and University of Westminster. You can see them there. The profiles of the people involved here, everybody in the left-hand column does logistics of one kind or another, some sort of expert in green logistics, and everybody in the right-hand column does engineering of one kind or another, for example, aerodynamics or engines or fuels and so on, vehicle dynamics. So that's what we've got, is we've got logistics and policy also at the University of Westminster and engineering. So the centre goes past that. Let me just show you one little graph. This graph shows the energy performance, the amount of energy used by a vehicle in a journey as a function of its load factor. So the load factor is, well, here are 4 different types of vehicles. The load factor is 1 if the vehicle is loaded in both directions, and it is 0.5 if it comes home empty. And you can see a couple of things. One is that if your vehicle was going to come home empty, but came home full instead, you would use 40% less fuel for the round trip. That's a lot less fuel. And it's very hard, you can spend billions of pounds, euros, dollars, improving engine performance or changing to electric vehicles or something. And it's pretty hard to get 40%, but just filling the vehicle up and coming home full gives you that. So 40% is a lot in this game. So, of course, the vehicle type, you can see here that in general, if you use a larger vehicle, you use less fuel per ton kilometre of freight transported as well. So there's an engineering aspect of this. Bigger vehicles use less fuel. There's a logistics aspect, which is come home full if you possibly can. And so you can see that both of these, broadly, the message is both engineering and logistics matter. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, but that just gives you the overall picture. Our centre focuses on 3 main things. It's technology and operations and policy, or engineering and logistics and policy. And so the organisations fit within this framework. In Cambridge, we focus on the engineering side, and Heriot-Watt, they focus on the Logistics Research Centre there, focuses on the logistics side. Westminster is halfway between logistics and policy. We do a lot of our policy work. We have a number of industrial partners in the operations space. You can see there supermarkets, UPS Turners, logistics service providers in Denby, and so on. These are companies that operate vehicles, use fuel, generate carbon, and have ESG requirements to reduce carbon emissions. Over here is a bunch of companies that build the vehicles that those logistics companies use. In between, there are a few companies that do technology for logistics, and they do software for routing or for hardware for material handling, that kind of thing. We've got a bunch of partners down here who are essentially policy partners, Department of Transport, Transport for London, Highways England, some organizations that live in policy and operations, and they are basically trade organizations, Logistics UK and Road Haulage Association, the two largest freight operational trade organizations serve those companies. And their job is essentially, or a big part of their job is lobbying government, so for the sector. And there's a similar group across the other side here. There's the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, Energy Systems Catapult, Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, which just changed its name last week to ZEMO. And so we live in the middle of this, juggling all of these balls, trying to keep this whole operation going. So that's an unusual partnership. It's a very good structure, works extremely well. The companies with logos pay us money in order to be part of the consortium and to be part of the research process and the decision-making process. The organizations without logos give us very good advice, but do not participate in the research, and they don't pay any money. So the research concept covers a very wide range. We're interested in technology and operations and policy, as we've mentioned. We have very much a triple bottom line approach to sustainability. People, planet, profit. You can't implement environmental solutions on vehicles, solutions that improve their environmental performance, without having good economics so that they're attractive to implement, and without having social and political buy-in from the community. So it's very important for us to look at all three aspects of sustainability. So it's not just about technology. The research covers a very broad range, from tactical to strategic. So that's kind of short term to long term, 2050 and beyond. Short term, what can we do today? What can we do next week, next year? Fundamental and applied. Some of that work is really basic stuff about fluid mechanics or how logistics and systems organize. Some is really applied. What sort of widget can we put on the vehicle or in the cab to reduce fuel consumption? And micro to macro, we look at things which at the level of an individual vehicle, an individual app for a driver or something like that, going right out to national and international scale logistics. What is the best way to run the country's logistics in order to minimize food miles, international food miles, or minimize fuel consumption and so on. So really a wide range of stuff. We have a core roadmap and so on. I'll just show you this slide very quickly, which just shows how we kind of think about the problem. This slide shows on the vertical axis, the reduction of greenhouse gases possible through various interventions in the vehicle, and on the horizontal axis, the barriers to mainstream adoption. That's important. The barriers to mainstream adoption are very important because there's no point implementing a measure which is only applicable to a small number of vehicles and which doesn't get taken up widely. If you want to make a difference to carbon emissions in the world, we have to have solutions which are widely adopted, and which means we have to have low barriers to technical, economic, and political barriers. And I can plot solutions across this whole space, energy reduction technologies down here in the right-hand corner, which typically can save 10% carbon, like improvements to aerodynamics. They have low barriers to adoption. They're easy to do. and we're doing them now, and we can improve on those things. You can do driver training and so on. There's all kinds of solutions which fit across this whole map. And none of them are in the top right-hand corner, which is where the very best ones would be. There's a bunch of solutions that are high up on the left-hand side of this graph, even higher up than the ones that are shown. And they are the real silver bullets that are out there, but they have high barriers to adoption. They've got all kinds of issues that have to be solved before they can be adopted. And we look in the center at a set of technologies which are basically in the upper right-hand corner of this chart. They're the ones that we're looking at for research purposes. We don't look at the ones down the bottom left-hand corner because they have small benefits and high barriers. And we think about projects that can reduce barriers to these big win technologies like electrification of the long haul or electrification of urban vehicles, biogas, and so on. Can we reduce those barriers and push them to the right? Can we increase the impact of the things which are down the bottom? Can we improve the performance gained by aerodynamics or lightweighting, driver performance? And we've organized that into a whole portfolio of projects. So this is our basic structure of what of our portfolio. We have a set of projects on data collection analysis, a set on logistics systems, and on vehicle technologies. And you can see down here, these three things: reducing barriers, increasing impact, and implementation. This is going nearer market as we go down. At the top, we've got kind of basic fundamental issues, which are long-term and where we've got to reduce barriers. In the middle, things the increasing impact projects, and implementation projects where we build tools for companies to use. And all our projects live on this map. Each one of these things is a project being undertaken in the center. The funding, color code is the funding. So EPSRC funds the red ones, and they are generally at the top of this chart. So they're the more fundamental research questions funded by EPSRC. The blue ones in the middle are funded by the industry partners. They say SRF. There's some green Innovate UK funding, and there's some black funding, black projects which are near market and on policy and so on about tools, and they're funded by what used to be called ETI. Just one other broad thing is that we have our little organization in the UK, Centre for Sustainable Road Freight in the UK. We think that it's very important that the whole world decarbonizes road freight. We've set up a partner organization in India with IIT Madras and IIM Ahmedabad, two really top schools for engineering and logistics. We set up another organization in China with Jilin Tongji and Zhejiang universities, again, logistics and engineering, and another one in South Africa with WITS and Stellenbosch universities. In each case, there's a bunch of industry partners on both sides, on logistics and engineering and policy partners. And so we've set up these 4 organizations all around the world, and that's a great system because we all have the same mission and we all have the same structure and we all partner together. So looking at each other's problems, we can exchange students and scholars, we can share tools and methods and data and ideas, and we'd have joint webinars and we can write applications together. And we can it's quite easy to get funding for travel in the old days when we used to do that, and joint projects and so on. I will not go over research highlights because I don't have time. There's lots of them. I'll draw some conclusions. We've got a strong ecosystem consisting of industry, government, academia. We've got customers and suppliers and partners and regulators. They're all in the pot, all working on sustainable road freight issues. We've got a strong research team across logistics, engineering, and policy. We've got a kind of holistic approach to the R&D in the sector, from the logistics and operations and soft side to the engineering and science and harder side to the policy. We've got a global problem, and so we've set up a global international network. And we think we have an opportunity to make a significant difference to the about 7 or 8% of the world's carbon dioxide which is emitted by road freight. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, David, for overview of what you guys do at the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight. So we would now like to open up the table to any questions for David. If anyone has any questions for David, please add them in the Q&A box now. I was just, while we wait for some questions to come in, David, do you want to give us maybe on your previous slide, I was interested to see some of the research highlights, maybe one or two you could just mention, if we have, given that we have a minute or two left.
Sure, if we have some time. Well, there's a wide range of things here. Let me just show you, here's an example. On the left, we've got some unique measurements taken in a towing tank of underbody flows underneath the body of a vehicle, taken by Holger Babinski and some of his students. It's a unique rig which takes account of the interaction between the bottom of the vehicle and the road, and the vehicle is moving over the road, so it gets that moving boundary, stationary boundary moving vehicle problem, and has given unique and fabulous insights. And you can see a few little pictures there showing some of the results from that work. One of the things that we've done as a result of that is aerodynamic improvements on Waitrose vehicles. And if you see, all Waitrose refrigerated vehicles now have a body shape which is defined by the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight. It reduces their fuel consumption on the highway by about 7%. So that's good, and it's been implemented across the fleet. So that's an interesting example of some applied research, also some very fundamental things being learnt about fluid dynamics in those kind of flow conditions, and being applied to real life and making a difference. So we definitely, are very keen to get the work out there into the field. I can continue. Maybe there's some questions.
Yeah, questions just come in, but thank you for that. So there's a question here from Harriet Hunnable, who's asking, Professor Cebon, given the attention hydrogen is getting and your assessment, in brackets negative, could you expand on the shortcomings of hydrogen?
I've just given evidence to the Science and Technology Committee this morning. There's a whole video, an hour of me expounding on hydrogen to a bunch of MPs. I encourage you to go and have a look there. In Parliament TV, Science and Technology Committee, and it was the hearing this morning. You could get me going on that for a good hour.
Okay, well, we don't have time for a whole hour now, but that's great. Maybe you could send us the link, or I can find it after today. And
yeah, I can probably stick it in the chat.
Yeah.
Possible as well.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I think if anyone else has any more questions for David, then please do put them in the Q&A. And we will probably then move on to our next speaker. But if there are any more questions for you come up, David, you can just type answers to them directly in the Q&A box
sure, as
we go ahead. Okay, so our next speaker today is Ruchi Choudhary from the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Ruchi. So it's over to you, and please do share your slides.
Yes. Do you see the screen?
It's just appearing now, yeah. There we go, yeah.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Eric, for organizing this event. So I run a research group called the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative, which started back in 2009 at Cambridge. And what I'm going to be showing you today is a project that has actually grown over the years and still continues to sustain itself as new challenges arise. So I'm going to be speaking of the subsurface. I'm going to take you to the underground, and it puts us right at the interface of infrastructure, cities, and transport, and in this case, transport infrastructure in particular. And I'm going to be talking about how to sustain the climate of the subsurface. Often when we speak about climate issues, climate change in particular, we are very much focused on the city above ground, and naturally so. It's something very visible. We can see the effect. But at the same time, we have plenty of reasons why we need to also track the climate of the underground. So why do we need to do so? With urbanization and land constraints, we see increased use of underground surfaces or spaces with deeper underground structures, which leads to different so-called phenomena of subsurface congestion. In fact, we're not the only ones. In fact, people have become aware of the need to regulate and understand the subsurface. And in fact, it's a well-established area of study in geography and environmental studies. And indeed, the first master plans of the underground, which started looking at how to plan the cities underground, arose in Helsinki and Singapore more recently in 2019. And within all this, whatever we build underground in terms of underground structures, whether we live in them or we transport goods or services in them, they have a significant influence on the surrounding ground, which is its hydrogeological makeup, which sees, any time you give a heat input into the ground, it has an impact on ground temperatures, but also groundwater flow. So the point being that the need for tracking underground climate is important. It's important for the resilience of ground resources such as water, energy, but it's also in the long term important for the energy efficiency of your underground structures and of any systems that are residing in the subsurface. So I'm going to take you through snippets of projects that we've been working on through these. We had started looking at the heat generated underground. Underground stations, as we know, especially in congested cities, they suffer from overheating, and London being the case also for these. And the question we were asking was that instead of it elevating in the long term the underground climate, can we usefully extract this heat using ground source heat pumps? And what, if we do, what would be the resulting change in tunnel and platform temperatures? And this project arose in the context when the Crossrail development was happening, and indeed there were discussions about putting ground heat exchangers in the tunnel lining and the infrastructure of the new stations that were being designed. And we said, okay, we know that it's going to be useful, but can we quantify the exact effects? Can we quantify how much heat we can usefully extract versus how much gets generated? And that ends up being a complex multi-physics problem. Also, a lot of what happens in the subsurface is a big unknown. So it also becomes very difficult to establish system boundaries when you're talking about entire train lines versus heat exchangers, not everywhere, but partially in some areas. And we know that, in the sense we can only partially know where these train lines are running. We know that ultimately inside there's a whole mess buried with all sorts of infrastructure lines. And so it's difficult, in a pragmatic sense, it's difficult to tell where you can usefully leverage the heat that's generated. But at the same time, it also comes with a lot of challenges with respect to pipeline, because the best point at which to act in these is at the time when the construction is being planned. Before, any retrofit later on is far more costly underground than when it's in planning stages. So with respect to model complexities, now, if you want to model an entire train line over several kilometers, that's a different kind of challenge. And here we found what suited best was to sort of take an abstraction where we would have a one-dimensional model of the central line as an example. So we started working with these, and we could apply many symmetry assumptions, etc., of similarities of stations across the line and identify which are the ones that we need to model in more detail. But now to integrate that with the analysis of the ground heat exchangers became a multi-physics problem, because the representation of the ground heat exchangers, that's a three-dimensional problem for which you need different types of finite element solvers. So we did what we call in the simulation world a co-simulation framework, where we had a system where these two simulation worlds were the 1D of the central line and the ground heat exchangers can exist independently, but iterate and exchange information over time steps. And the result of it, what we really wanted to show was that how much would we manage to cool the tunnels and the platforms if we were to put heat exchangers in the ground surrounding the tunnels at different spacing locations. And indeed, we can get up to 5-degree difference in there if you extract heat that's generated in the tunnels, thereby saving you the need to cool the tunnels during summertime. And the co-simulation framework was important and necessary, rather than just making assumptions that, okay, you are going to extract that amount of heat because of the variability of the behavior along the line. And to work out exactly what configurations of the spacing along the boreholes and the distance from the tunnels would make sense. So with this information, we did a little bit of further analysis and took a section of the line, and you recognize Hyde Park and on the north side, Regent's Park peeking down. So we picked buildings that were around the central line, and we sort of allocated them into clusters of similar thermal demand. And essentially one borehole along the tunnel could serve the heating needs of one UK household in sort of, if we just wanted to get an average figure, or the hot water demand of all the building types across all the clusters here. And of course, the key assumption we made here is that you're going to be extracting uniformly along the tunnel line, and also that we were optimizing the entire system to cool the tunnel rather than to extract as much heat as is needed above the ground. So this was an exercise that was highly focused on saying, okay, we want to cool the tunnel down by 5 degrees. If we extract that heat, how much will it serve above the ground? Now, moving forward from this project, I don't know if many of you following the news 3 years earlier, there were a series of very interesting articles that came out in the newspaper following a study that was conducted by geographers in Newcastle University, where they were talking about the underground development and the increase of underground development in London in particular because of its planning constraints, etc. And, my reaction to this was that if it doesn't affect the climate underground, if, in the sense in the long term, then why not? Why not? Why can't we exploit resources underground to the extent that that is possible? So sure, if there are, over here it's listed, if there are 1,000, 2,000 buildings and they have a marginal impact on the overall climate, sure enough, you can continue to do that and there's no problem. But what if it started happening in a manner that was not regulated? And so we said, okay, let's figure this out. So we took one borough in London where, we had noticed an increase in planning permissions for basement construction. And we took all the existing residential basements. So these are, I'm not talking about the super mega basements that were reported in the earlier study. I'm talking about regular residential basements that, let's assume, are heated comfortably to 18 degrees. And 15-kilometer of train tunnels. And we said, okay, how much heat does that result in? Can we sustain that in the long term? And so we modeled the basements, and this included also the new basement proposals that came through between 2008 and 2017. And we added the train lines that are passing through the borough, along with the detailed geology and hydrological information that we were able to get from British Geological Survey, who have been excellent partners ever since in this work. So with all of this information put together, we had to translate that into a numerical model, which required some degrees of abstraction. So whether it's on how to model the train tunnels as they go down, or how to model different, the entire 3D domain of the borough, as well as the residential basement, and of course the geology and hydrology. And this is basically showing you the results. Now, if we take on the left-hand side, you see two cross-sections as an example. And basically what it's showing is that if you are sitting primarily in what is called London clay formation, which is less permeable, you're going to see the temperature changes or the ground thermal disturbances at specific points with big fluctuations in between those points. So if I wanted to extract heat from this area, I would have a slightly different strategy where I would be sure that I would be locating my heat exchangers closer to where the heat sources are. On the contrary, if you were towards where you have more permeable ground, gravel in this case, the groundwater flow sort of results in smearing out the heat sources. And so I would be less concerned about where the ground's heat exchangers were located in order to optimally extract that heat from the ground. And so this is again showing you the same on a plane at 3-meter depth. And again, it's showing you the south side, which is more permeable, and hence the heat gain due to the sources smears out much more than what you see on the north side of the borough. Now, one of the key challenges in doing such large-scale and complex models is that a lot of the input parameters that you give in there can be highly uncertain. And so one of the ways that we as engineers tackle with that problem is that we get some data and we try to match our data and model. But that proves to be challenging at this scale, and especially in the subsurface, because measurements are sparse. So we have been working on tackling that challenge in terms of developing new kind of calibration techniques with mixed fidelity models and sparse observations to be able to do so, and thereby infer a bit better on our knowledge on the most influential parameters that govern the behavior. In this case, the thickness of gravel, or the density of basements, or the initial temperature, or the surface cover type. And going forward, we did, a similar exercise where we took all of this information that we were able to get, and we decided to do a little exercise on the geothermal potential of this area. And here again, the key message that we want to take, and this is this slide, where again the left part is sitting in primarily in the impermeable part, which is the London clay formation, and the right part is in the terrace deposits. And here what we are trying to do is we don't want the ground to go below freezing point, because you keep extracting heat from the ground and you're going to freeze the ground at some point over the years. So here what we show is again that the effect is less when you're in the terrace deposits, because the behavior is governed so much by the groundwater flow. which smears it out, and then you're able to also extract from most locations and have much less of this phenomena of the ground freezing as you extract heat from the ground. Whereas on the left-hand side, you can be more susceptible, especially at greater depths. So the point being that there would be spatial variabilities of the subsurface potential, depending on what we are doing, and also on the hydrogeological makeup of the ground. And that's important to consider as we begin to look into the subsurface for all kinds of exploitations, be it energy or space. And I will stop here. But just to, so we have a very good team working on this and good collaborations, and more ideas and more collaborations from the audience would be welcome.
Great, thank you very much, Ruchi, for a really interesting presentation, and great to see how engineering and geology all come together here in this. Here's a question for you that's just come in on the Q&A, so let's go straight to that. So the question is, can basements be dug out from scratch, or do they need to come at the creation of the building? I guess, can they come afterwards?
Well, I won't claim to be an expert on that, but if you walk around London, you will see, especially in the current climate, where we do have the time and space to do construction. You'll see these boardings, and if you look carefully, they will be able to sort of tell you these are dedicated new basement constructions that are happening on existing buildings.
Right.
So yes, in terms of cost effectiveness, the ideal time is to do them earlier.
Yeah. I was also going to ask myself, so I mean, there's obviously like a lot of potential here to use heat that's in the trapped or that's stored in the ground for a range of things, including for heating of homes. So is there much in terms of, are you seeing much interest in terms of application of these, what you're working on, to use directly as heating for homes as a way of decarbonising heating and getting away from gas in heating of homes in London and elsewhere?
Well, there has been a continuous interest in this, and in fact, the biggest barrier is the cost of drilling the borehole. Yeah. So it's the cost, but sorry, it's not just the cost, but it's also the space that's needed. So that's always the challenge. But there are several closed loop systems in London, not enough, but there are. And there is definitely scope to exploit it much more, because any place where we are rejecting heat underground, it's it's sustainable to extract it at some point before the ground gets overheated. So, and it's definitely, it's a natural transition to a renewable resource. It's a more sustainable resource. So yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. Thank you very much. If there's any more questions for Ruchi, then please add those in the Q&A. And if any more come up as we go on, then you can type answers directly into the Q&A, Ruchi. And then I think we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next keynote speaker for today is Jenna Panter from the MRC Epidemiology Unit. So Jenna, I'll hand over to you and ask you to share your screen, please. And there we go.
Can you see those slides?
Yeah, we can see them. Yeah, great.
That's great. So thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for listening. My name is Jenna Panter, and along with Jean Adams, David Ogilvie and Martin White, I co-lead the Population Interventions Programme at the MRC Epidemiology Unit, based in the School of Clinical Medicine here at the University of Cambridge. Our programme aims to evaluate and understand the impacts of a range of changes in the environment, whether implemented for health reasons or not, on health outcomes. And as a trained epidemiologist and environmental scientist, I'm speaking to you today on these two interlinked topics of urban design and health. So from a health perspective, the biggest burdens faced by the global population are investigated in the large Global Burden of Diseases study. And this study provides a synthesis of the available evidence on the levels and trends in health outcomes and risk factors for those outcomes. And the 2019 study showed that the largest increases in risks to premature deaths and disability between 1990 and 2019 were ambient particulate matter pollution, high body mass index, a measure of obesity, and elevated glucose levels, which is often a precursor to diabetes where not enough insulin is produced in the body. Now, physical activity is a recognised strategy central to the prevention, treatment and management of diabetes and obesity. Physical inactivity itself was responsible for almost 10% of global premature mortality in 2008, which equated to about 5.3 million of the 57 million deaths that occurred worldwide in 2008. So with the spread of COVID by airborne particulates, air quality and ventilation is higher on people's priority list. Results from an ecological study in the US suggest that areas with higher rates of air pollution also have correspondingly higher rates of COVID deaths. And these results are confirmed from a study in Italy. And whilst these studies are ecological in nature and therefore not conclusive, it suggests that people living in these areas may be more vulnerable and that action to tackle air pollution is even more important. So these health and air quality challenges are in the face of needing to reduce carbon emissions. This graph is based on data from the UK government and shows UK carbon emissions by sector over time and indicates that although emissions have decreased substantially in the last 30 years, the transport sector has now overtaken the energy supply sector as the main producer of emissions. It's also the only sector in the UK where carbon emissions continue to increase. So you can see from this pie chart that there's a substantial portion of the transport sector emissions come from passenger cars, with aviation, railways and HGVs making up sizably smaller contributions, although aviation often receives more attention than private motor vehicles. So if we want to reduce carbon emissions in the transport sector, we need to tackle emissions from private motor vehicles. And one potential way to do that is to encourage people to switch some journeys from car to walking and cycling. And this could be a win-win with substantial gains for air quality and health, and need to physical activity being integrated into everyday life, potentially creating healthy habits. So here I just want to pause and talk a little about the potential gains for health. A landmark paper published in 2009 compared the modelled health benefits of several ways of meeting carbon reduction targets. Several scenarios were modelled up until 2030, and here I'm going to show data for London, looking at the impact in 3 domains: air pollution, physical activity and injuries. And I'm just going to compare 2 of the scenarios here, the lower carbon vehicle scenario and the more active travel scenario. And you can see with the lower carbon scenario, which is achieved through decarbonising the vehicle fleet, this results in lives saved from air pollution. But in the active travel substitution scenario, where an increase in walking and cycling replaces car trips, there's an increase in lives lost from injuries as people take to bikes. But these are substantially outweighed by benefits from increased physical activity. So there may be concerns that shifting people to walking and cycling might not translate into gains from health if people compensate for that activity. Fortunately, our research has found that people who take up walking and cycling for transport don't compensate by doing less activity at other times, finding that when they take up these forms of travel, their levels of recreational activities such as going to the gym or playing football, and total activity increase. Similarly, for those who switch from the car to more active modes of travel, we see reductions in measures of body mass index, that measure of obesity I mentioned earlier from the Global Burden of Disease study. So what are the carbon impacts of switching to walking and cycling for transport? A previous study in Cardiff showed that if 41% of car trips, that's all those short trips, less than 3 miles, which are easily switchable, were made on foot or by bike, there would be about a 5% reduction in carbon emissions. So the trips that were not easily switchable, or defined as easily switchable here, were the ones where a short trip involved multiple destinations in the same trip. That's so-called trip chaining. They involved escorting someone to or from a place, or shopping trips to large retail areas, which often involve the purchase of bulky items. Similarly, in a European study, which followed 2,000 people over time, those who switched to just one trip, so they switched just one trip per day from car driving to cycling, reduced their carbon footprint by about 0.5 tonnes a year, representing a substantial share of average per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And the largest benefits from shifts were for business travel, followed by social and leisure trips, and commuting to work or study. So how might we design our towns and cities to enable people to walk and cycle? Well, the historical and recent investments in road building will make that challenging. But what about if alongside that we built more footpaths, pavements and cycle lanes that connected with the public transport routes to make a more integrated and connected route? And well, we looked at this in our local evaluation of the Cambridgeshire guided busway. And the busway comprises a new public transport network and a traffic-free path for pedestrians and cyclists that runs alongside the busway. It links towns and villages to the northwest of the city, with the city itself, the science park and the biomedical campus. Buses run on a completely segregated guideway along most of the route, collecting data on travel and physical activity in a sample of individuals living in and around Cambridge and working in areas served by the busway. We set up a cohort study. And this type of studies involves surveying the same individuals. And we did that annually between 2009 and 2012, before and after the opening of the busway. So what did we find? So in terms of effects of the busway, we found that exposure to the new infrastructure that was measured by proximity was associated with a significantly greater likelihood of a large decrease in car trips, that's at least a 30% drop, and a large increase in the proportion of commuting trips involving any active travel. Now that 30% equates to changing the mode of travel used for 3 out of 10 trips made per week. And our results also suggest that increases in active commuting were not offset by compensatory decreases in recreational walking or cycling, or even total activity. So what does all this mean for carbon? Well, between 2009 and 2012, carbon emissions as a result of commuting trips increased in the sample. So we combined those participants who had small changes in their carbon emissions, around 3 kilograms per week or less, approximating to the emissions attributable to one average one-way car-based commuting trip as no change. We wanted to look at the impacts for more sizable changes in carbon emissions. And we found that those living close to the busway were less likely to increase their carbon emissions. But we found no evidence that it was associated directly with decreases. So what about if planners and urban designers focus just on walking and cycling infrastructure rather than integrating those with public transport systems, given that this might be maybe less expensive in relative terms? So we also looked at the impact of high quality walking and cycling routes across the UK in our iConnect project. Here, 80 new high quality walking and cycling routes between 2009 and 2013 were funded by Sustrans, walking and cycling charity, and the Big Lottery. In this study, we examined the travel patterns of around 1,700 people living in areas where the infrastructure had been constructed. And when we examined the changes in travel after 1 year, we found that exposure to these new paths was not associated with changes in walking, cycling, or total physical activity. But when we repeated the analysis 2 years later, we found there were substantial changes. And these coefficients show the effect on walking, cycling, or total physical activity in minutes per week for each additional kilometre closer to the infrastructure. So those living 1 kilometre from the infrastructure reported about 12 minutes per week more activity than those living 2 kilometres, and 45 minutes more for those living 4 to 5 kilometres away. These lagged results suggest that the new infrastructure, these new paths, areas and routes may take time to bed in, or for people to get used to them or know about them. So how did this new infrastructure impact on carbon emissions? And unfortunately, these effects didn't translate into sizable carbon effects, as neither, oh, excuse me, as neither, oh, dear me, sorry, as neither living near the infrastructure nor using it predicted changes in carbon emissions, either overall or disaggregated by journey purpose. So this lack of discernible effect on emissions is consistent with an interpretation that some living near the infrastructure may have simply changed where they walked or cycled, while others may have walked or cycled more, and many may have substituted active for motorised modes of travel, but few as a direct result of the intervention. So while the findings to date can't exclude the possibility of small effects of the new routes on emissions, a more comprehensive approach of a higher dosage of active travel promotion linked with policies targeted at reducing motorised transport are needed if we're going to achieve the substantial carbon savings that are needed to meet climate change mitigation and energy security goals. So our past work has shown that these policies to reduce driving could be really effective in changing behaviour. In a longitudinal study, we found that where people had no parking at work, they were much more likely to switch from a car to active modes. Our work also looks at these types of disincentives, so-called sticks, but it's much harder to design studies to look at the impacts because they're often more publicly and politically unacceptable. So Emma Lawlor, a postdoc in our group, will speak later about some of the work we've done on understanding what needs to happen to get these interventions implemented. And one of our PhD students, Christina, has already spoken in the series about her review on these so-called carrots and sticks. And as she showed, work looking at the impacts of these on actual behaviour with before and after studies is
Oh, we seem to have lost Jenna there. Is it just me or has everyone else lost Jenna as well?
Yeah, we've lost her.
Yeah.
I think everyone else lost it. Okay, right. Right, I think, well, let's hope she can return in a second and then we can move over to the Q&A for Jenna. In the meantime, maybe we should just go ahead with the next speaker and then we can tack on the Q&A for Jenna after the next speaker so that she has some time to rejoin. So, sorry about that. So let's move on to our next speaker then for today, which is Dr. Timea Nokta from the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction, if I'm right. And so Timea, over to you, and please share your screen and then we'll do the Q&A for both you and Jenna at the end of your talk, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. I'm just trying to find which one of these screens is the right one.
Yes.
Are you seeing the slides that covered the whole?
Your slides, yeah, that's great. Over to you.
And not the presenter view, I assume.
No, just the slides, yeah.
Great, perfect. So yeah, thank you very much, Eric. And thank you very much to everyone who is joining this afternoon as well. My name is Timea Nokta, and I am in fact a research associate at the Center for Smart Infrastructure and Construction in the Department of Engineering. And the project that I'm going to present today is a collaboration with a colleague from the University of Birmingham. So Dr. Louise Reardon is a lecturer in public management in Birmingham, and as well as Dr. Lee Wan, who is a lecturer at the Department of Land Economy. And the project is looking at facilitating policy change for low carbon mobility, and specifically the role of multi-level governance in that. It is funded by the Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, which is based at the University of Oxford. So yeah, thank you to them for the very nice slides as well. I think that this has been actually introduced in the previous presentation. So just very quickly, although a low carbon mobility system is in fact integral to energy demand reductions and essential if the UK wants to meet its target of net zero emissions by 2020. Despite the UK having legally binding targets for over a decade, emissions from transport in fact have grown, and the sector is now the largest emitter, accounting for over 28% of the emissions in the UK. And with regards to the local level, in Birmingham, this share is actually about the same as the national average, but in Cambridge, it is considerably higher even than that number. So therefore, via tower demand management needs to be a core focus of local strategies to decrease carbon emissions. Current approaches are clearly found wanting. Therefore, urgent and significant policy change is required. However, the majority of transport scholarship in fact focuses on either technological fixes or societal issues such as behavior change for enabling low carbon mobility. And of course, these studies are extremely important. However, there is an issue that questions of governance have largely been ignored in this area. And just what is this governance that I'm talking about? So we understand governance as the process through which networks of societal actors interact and shape outcomes, or in our case, low carbon mobility. And so in order to address this lack of research into transport governance and its role in moving towards low carbon mobility, this research has two specific objectives: to identify and explain the role of multi-level governance in shaping local policy responses towards low carbon mobility, and to outline governance interventions that can support transformative policy change towards low carbon mobility. And so to analyze the structure and practices that shape the governance process and outcomes, we combine methodological approaches from political science and also engineering to provide a systemic analysis of the low carbon mobility challenge. This combines network analysis and problem analysis, comparing multi-level governance networks in the UK across two city regions, Birmingham and Cambridge. The network analysis is used to map the organizations and their relationships to each other, constituting the governance network. This method takes a relational perspective on social phenomena and presents it as a structure consisting of nodes and ties between them, creating network graphs which can be analyzed using appropriate statistical methods. The explanatory power of this form of network analysis with regards to outcomes lies with the different ways in which the network structure enables or constrains flows of influence, information, and resources. The problem analysis is used to identify the beliefs and narratives of network actors that they hold in relation to the problem of low carbon mobility and their ability to address it. In particular, we use a participatory group causal loop mapping technique to understand and analyze the governance network processes. In terms of explanatory power, this method then allows for representing and evaluating system complexity. So reconstructing networks for analysis entails mapping relevant levels of the multi-level governance of low carbon mobility. For example, international, national, metropolitan, regional, and local. Seeking out those organizations that are involved in the governance processes of how low carbon mobility, and this involves transport, but also links to other sectoral policymaking such as climate change or energy, and also actors exerting influence over the policymaking and implementation. These may involve organizations from the public and private, as well as the third sectors, and therefore this analysis is not restricted to government bodies. Links between the actors represent one of three relationships: flows of authoritative influence, information, and resources, for example, funding. So this research actually involves reconstructing both formal and informal governance networks. The formal networks, or as they are seen from the outside, as we say, I reconstructed from local, regional, and national policy documents, consultation protocols, minutes of meetings, press releases, media reports, and also previous studies. as opposed to the formal ones, the informal networks, or as they are seen by the actors involved in these networks, are developed using insights gained from interviews with actors from across the two multi-level case study networks. So this project is actually currently in the data collection stage at the moment, and these networks are still being constructed. But because the study is very much about methods for understanding governance in this particular area, I wanted to show some examples of how these, how we envisage that these insights can contribute to developing conclusions from the study. So this is an example of a study that compares formal and informal network structures in the construction sector. And this particular study represents formal and informal interorganizational institutional arrangements involved in 4 construction projects based in Hong Kong and Germany as networks. It goes on to develop a fit index between the formal and informal networks using various network statistical measures, for example, network density, average path length, node centrality measures, and then links them to project performance indicators. And actually, the authors found that this fit between formal and informal institutions is positively correlated with project performance. So this is an example that highlights the importance of understanding the interplay between the formal and informal institutional arrangement and their impact on real-world outcomes, in this case, project performance. And then going forward, in addition to the structural analysis of networks, we also want to understand how actors involved in these governance networks perceive the challenge of low carbon mobility and how this impacts on the actions that they take to address it. So in order to do so, stakeholder workshops will be used to facilitate discussion and collaboratively identify variables perceived to affect movement towards low carbon mobility. For example, issues such as propensity to cycle or access to funding. Connections and causality between those variables, for example, positive or negative links, will be identified. Workshop outcomes will then be represented as virtual causal loop diagrams to facilitate discussion, to understand which of the variables participants feel they are in fact in the position to influence and why, and the extent to which they do influence them directly or indirectly. So this aspect of the study will not only produce valuable insight regarding potentially overlooked leverage points for governance interventions, but in fact, they also have policymakers and stakeholders to better understand the systemic nature of the issue and the opportunities to act. As with the network analysis, the problem mapping is also in its data collection stage. So going forward, it will follow a similar process as this example, mapping the causes of obesity in a rural Australian region. So this study applies the group causal loop mapping and analysis method to the development, implementation, and evaluation of childhood obesity prevention efforts. The authors use group discussions with policymakers, experts, and community members to create a causal loop diagram representing community perceptions of determinants and causes of obesity. And then the study goes on to identify 4 domains of intervention, such as social influences, fast food and junk food, participation in sport, and general physical activity. And as well as specific, also identify specific actions, for example, home cooking campaign and training for parents. And so it represents how causal loop analysis as a method can be used to identify concrete actions through engaging with complexity, which is our goal in this project as well. So at the end of the study, so in about a year's time, actually, we expect to develop research outcomes both for policy and practice. And in the policy space, we will use the methods introduced previously to identify misalignments between the formal and informal networks and problem framings, and develop recommendations for how current UK governance arrangements can be adjusted or supported to enable a more effective policy response towards low carbon mobility at the local level. Furthermore, we also expect to produce recommendations for the provision of evidence that can support low carbon mobility policy and implementation. A recent study co-authored by my colleague Luis, who is the PI on these projects, found that in fact only 13% of transport studies papers within a particular period considered a specific aspect of the policy cycle, and that 60% focus on tools for policy, and 2/3 of papers did not engage with real-world policy examples or policymakers. And in fact, important questions of governance, such as context, power, resources, and legitimacy, are largely being ignored in this literature. In collaboration with Dr. Levan from the Department of Land Economy, we also expect to produce insights for transport modelers regarding potential gaps between modeling assumptions and recommendations, so the evidence provision side, and stakeholders' constraints in terms of implementation of those recommendations. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Timea. And yes, if anyone has any questions for Timea, then please enter those in the Q&A now. We'll do the Q&A for Timea first, and then we can go back to Jenna, who's managed to rejoin our call. I was going to ask you, Timea, you had one slide where you were comparing some public and private providers of public transport in your network there, and looking at different countries as well. Do you have any sort of early findings maybe about whether public or private funded transport companies like that are more effective or less effective? And is that something you're looking at?
Can you rephrase that question? I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, sorry, I just noticed on one of your slides you had two columns, one showing like publicly run public transport providers, and one was like private funded companies. And I just wonder whether there is, because it's often a debate in the UK whether the railways, for example, should be publicly run or privately run, and whether your research shows at all, or whether you will be looking at, which way is more effective out of those two.
Yeah, so actually we are not looking at that particular issue, but we are looking at how those providers, independently of where they sit, are engaged in the production and implementation of policies. So
right.
It's and it's different between Cambridge and Birmingham. So there are many different versions of that, even within the UK. And if you look at like international scale, obviously it's even more diverse. So I don't think it's something that necessarily is a sort of binary question or that kind of comparison. But what we will be looking at though is how they are involved in these networks, and whether that influences their ability to, for example, deliver the kind of pledges that they take, or the mandates that they have, for example, from governments to reduce emissions.
Right, okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cool. If there's any more questions for Timea, then please put them in the Q&A box, and then you can type answers to them if they come up. So Jenna, are we able to go back to you to finish off your last few slides of your presentation? If you can hear me now.
Sure.
I think Jenna had a power cut, which is why she suddenly dropped out.
Sorry, everyone. Let me just share the last few slides. Oops. Can you see those?
Not yet, no.
Okay. You see those now?
It's just coming up now, yeah.
Oops.
Yeah. I keep worrying that I'm going to have a power cut suddenly and that I'll cut out. So I can just imagine the pain.
So I don't know at what point you lost, but I think I was just talking about the disincentives and how hard they are to evaluate because they're not so politically and publicly acceptable. And so I was just going to want to say that Emma, who's a postdoc in our group, will speak later about some of the work we've done about understanding what needs to happen to get these interventions implemented. And one of our postdocs, Christina, I think has already spoken in this series about her review on these so-called carrots and sticks. And as she showed, there are relatively few studies that look at the kind of before and after effects of these types of interventions. So I was just going to finish by reflecting about how I thought urban areas might be designed in a post-COVID era. And I think we have a real opportunity to redesign our towns and cities in a way that's more sustainable. Public transport might be seen less favourably in the COVID context, but walking and cycling are seeing a real resurgence. So I think new cycling infrastructure, including traffic-free paths dedicated to cyclists and pedestrianised streets, and more green space or outside space for outside eating and socialising would be important. Green spaces are becoming more valued, so these will also be increasingly important. But with large swathes of land being unavailable, these kind of types of interventions I think are going to be much more common, these kind of modal filtering of streets, which prioritises pedestrians and cyclists and restricts motor vehicles. And they're going to be even more important for transport, but also as a place to meet and socialise. So like the other presenters, I just wanted to acknowledge the research programme that I'm working within and the funders of the projects that I've talked about, and you can find information on our website or on Twitter.
Great, thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions for Jenna, then please add them in the Q&A now. I'm just going to, there was one question earlier which was shared in the chat. I'm just going to read it out for the benefit for everyone. That from Anil, who asked, do you know the accident rate of bicyclists or cyclists in the UK and how it compares against a country with good bicycle infrastructure like the Netherlands? I see you've actually already answered it. Sorry, Jen, I didn't see that response.
That's okay, no problem.
But you were saying that given how car drivers and cyclists are more used to each other's behaviour in the Netherlands, you would imagine the rates are lower there, and the infrastructure is quite different in those contexts. So I mean, that obviously ties in with what you were just saying in terms of getting this new kind of infrastructure that we need. Does anyone else have any further questions for Jenna they want to put in the Q&A? I was just going to ask myself as well, I mean, do you work a lot with, a lot of the examples you were giving were Cambridge-based examples like the Cambridge busway, etc. Are you working closely with the City Council to see how they can implement these kind of changes in the post-COVID context?
Yeah, we are. That's a really good question. We're working with them. Obviously, there have been quite a few local changes, thinking about the Mill Road Bridge, for example. That was closed back in late 2019 for some repair work. So yeah, we've been looking at some routinely collected data they've got to look at the impact of that. One of our postdocs, Richard Patterson, has been working on that data. But we also work, like you were saying, we've got collaborators nationally and kind of internationally. We're hoping to do some work in the next coming years with some people in Colombia, in Bogota. So looking at the impacts of transport, new kind of transit systems and cable cars there to look at the impacts on physical activity as well. So a really kind of diverse set of interventions.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, yeah, that sounds really interesting, and it's great to see that you're working with the local council so directly on this stuff. Okay, I think we'll probably move on then to our next speaker, if that's okay. Oh, just before I go, one final question literally just popped up in the Q&A. So for Jenna, so the question is from Franz Furst, who's asking any thoughts on how we can incentivize those who are most in need of these interventions but might be least likely to take them up, such as high BMI makes cycling or walking much harder.
So that's a really good question. So we haven't done much work on this, but one of the questions that we have posed in the busway study was trying to look at whether it benefited people who were least or most active. So they're those people who are already active, and actually we found that it really had a stronger effect in those who were least active or who hadn't walked or cycled before, which was which was great in terms of population benefits. But we do know in general that these types of environmental interventions tend to benefit those kind of all parts of society equally. And also it requires less agency. So it's not that somebody has to kind of actively open a leaflet or get a tablet or you know, have particular knowledge about a specific type of I don't know, behavior change technique or something. So these are quite equitable in terms of the interventions, because like I say, they're sustainable, they're embedded into the world for, you know, in theory, as long as we're around for, and they're equitable because they can reach a variety of different groups.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I think we'll move on to our next speaker then. Thanks a lot, Jenna, and I'm glad we managed to get through the technical issues there. So our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Ainalis from the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, who'll be speaking on decarbonising the UK's long-haul road freight at minimum economic cost. And here is your screen. So over to you, Daniel.
Great, thanks very much, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Eric said, my name is Daniel and I work at the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight. And I want to talk to everyone today a little bit about some highlights and a high-level overview of this white paper that we produced in July of last year. And so we're specifically looking at how to decarbonize our big heavy goods vehicles that carry around our freight in time for 2050. So just a quick snapshot of where we are and where we're going. In the UK, we know that transport is the largest emitter by sector now, and road transport has a big portion of that. And while that's dominated by passenger cars and light duty vehicles, for a relatively small fleet size, HGVs in the UK contribute around 18% of road transport emissions, and that corresponds to about 5% of the UK's total. So for a relatively small fleet, they really do have a significant impact in our carbon emissions, and they're really a hard to abate sector, and I can discuss that in a moment. And if we look at, this is taken from a study by the ICCT, and looking at freight activity and life cycle emissions forecasting out to about 2050. And what we're seeing is that we're going to see some more increases in freight across the board, but we're particularly going to see a large increase in heavy trucks. And so that's going to pose a real problem when we try and decarbonize. Another thing that is sort of a little bit of an aside is that we've seen electrification rapidly taking off across light duty vehicles. So there are a lot of vans that are currently switching to full electric options, and also passenger cars. So we can sort of see a roadmap to where they're going to go in terms of low carbon or zero tailpipe. But for HGVs, the options are a little bit less clear. Another small chart that I wanted to show is around the carbon budget that we have remaining and the actions that we need to take. So you can see here we've got the amount of CO2 emissions versus the year, so our totals. And what we are really seeing, if we look at all these proposed pathways, if we want to maintain or limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees, we really need to start making some significant drastic changes now. We can't really be waiting until the last 2045 and then the last 5 years we can switch everything on and get to net zero. We really need to be start taking action now and making deep inroads where we can. So what we want to see is any solution needs to be widespread by 2040. So it needs to be out there and everyone can access it. And so this brings me on to the three primary options that are around available for decarbonising HGVs. and you have the large onboard battery electric, such as the Tesla Semi, with rapid or fast chargers supporting them. You've got small onboard battery electric HGVs that are supported by an electric road system. And you also have hydrogen fuel cells, which are essentially an electric powertrain with some hydrogen storage tanks and an electrolyzer on board to be able to convert that hydrogen into electricity. So without going into too much detail about why we have chosen the middle option, which is an electric road system to support small onboard battery electric vehicles, you can read more about that in the white paper. The sort of main benefits that are provided by such a infrastructure vehicle combination are, we've got a system that is mature, scalable, and shovel ready. So in terms of an electric road, we're looking at something like the Siemens e-highway, which you can see in the middle there, which is functions essentially like a train pantograph overhead line system. I'll explain a little bit about the details in a moment, but these systems have been proven and tested and they're ready to go now. The other benefit is that we have minimum use of resources and energy. So we're not going to be able to scale up our renewables, in my opinion, to make up for the additional amounts that we're going to need that are wasted through other processes. And storage, large scale storage, is a bit tricky. So we can minimize the amount of energy, and also we don't need enormous batteries on the vehicle. So they'll only need it when they travel off these electric road systems. So you'll be able to minimize the amount of critical and conflict materials, and also the cost of those batteries. And another good point about these systems is that they're technology neutral. So if operators do decide to go down an alternative route, whether it might be hydrogen or having a slightly larger onboard battery pack, this system, it can accommodate all of those things. So the last little bits of decarbonisation that we'd need to reach can all be supported by this electric road system. So we've got this proposal that we put together, which is called the UK Electric Motorway System, the UK EMS. And so it is founded on having an electric road system, a Siemens e-highway, across the UK, about 7,500 kilometres, including all the associated infrastructure. And so the system you can see on the top left here is that along the side of the motorway, you've got a series of poles and arms that support the catenary wires, which sit over here. And then the vehicle has an active pantograph system that's able to connect up and down. So when it joins the motorway and goes into the lane where it's electrified, it can easily connect. And then if it needs to move out of that lane, it can automatically retract, or that can be done at the push of a button. So the vehicles still maintain their mobility without having to sacrifice that connection. As part of the proposal, we talked about and specified some HGV vehicle architectures that would be suitable for the transition period and beyond. So the transition period is really important, because while this network is not built out, we need to be able to ensure that, you know, your Amazon packages and your supermarket groceries can still be delivered. And the program that we put together is comprised of 4 phases and can be completed by 2040. So it can be ready in time for net zero. So just to give a quick overview of the rollout plan, I've got a map of the UK here, and I've got all 4 phases that will step out. So in each phase, we've got the length of electric road system that's covered, the cost of each section, how much HGV kilometers are covered, And then we've got an estimate of the carbon savings that we can get for all HGVs in the UK. So the zeroth phase is a pilot phase, which we need to do to de-risk the rollout and work out how these, how to build these in the UK, what's different, what planning permissions are needed, and so on. And so that trial will then set up a first phase of a large scale rollout that you can see for about £5.5 billion would cover almost 50% of HGV journeys. And you can see it goes from Dover up around the M25 in London. It travels up to the north and covers across from Liverpool all the way out to Immingham and Grimsby and Doncaster out that side. And also it's got a connection to the port of Felixstowe. And that will provide a reduction of around 31% of the carbon emissions for HGVs. And then if we roll out a second phase, we can keep joining up more dots as we go. And we can then continue on building that out further up to a full-scale rollout for just under £20 billion, but that eliminates almost entirely, covers almost all the HGV kilometres that are travelling around the country. We did some simple economic evaluations to look at how the economics will play out across the infrastructure provider who would build it and sell electricity, the fleet operators, and the Treasury. And I'm running out of time, so I will skip over this very quickly and just say we can't get rid of HGVs, they're vital to the economy, but we really need to decarbonise. And so we have a proposal that can do that for an affordable price, and we can see a future where the UK can be completely decarbonised from a freight perspective.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel, and that's a very interesting talk. We've got time for one quick question. I think there's a question here from Jonathan Rosser, who's asking, how does this research and the white paper relate to the Committee on Climate Change report and the accompanying Element Energy report that concluded that by the mid-2030s, the electric road system are unlikely to be needed for the net zero transition, and that the UK system is unlikely to play a significant role in decarbonising road freight? Did they make different assumptions? What are the differences in the research between their work and your work?
That's a good question. So I'm not quite sure of exactly which report you're referring to. Most of the reports that have come out that I've seen from the Committee on Climate Change and related and work done for the DFT have all at this point looked and said it's all up in the air at the minute, and that there are electric road systems and hydrogen are potential options. But what's really needed is in the next 5 years to do some large scale trials to really prove the case, because there's a lot of challenges around hydrogen. There could be some advancements in battery technology and we can get a breakthrough, but I think that will be very unlikely. And so we really need to find a solution that works now. We can't sort of wait until 2035 and then, say, oh, well, we've got a solution that finally works.
Daniel, I can add to that. We have reanalyzed that Element Energy report, and there are many assumptions in it that we don't agree with. The analysis was obscure and opaque, and we had to really spend a lot of time to unpick it. But for example, they make assumptions about the total, the take-up of the technology, which we think are unrealistic, and about the cost of stationary charging infrastructure, which is unrealistic. And when we do the exact same analysis as Element Energy to calculate the total cost of ownership, we get a completely different answer to them. So we think that actually their numbers are not correct, and that work needs to be reviewed, both the element energy and the Ricardo work, similar Ricardo work, which actually has been revised 5 times and repeatedly putting out another economic analysis of exactly the same thing. When we look at it, the benefits, the economic benefits of the electric road are so obvious and enormous compared to the alternative hydrogen system that it's an absolute no-brainer. And it's only through rather obscure assumptions which are hidden down in the depths of their report that they managed to find something different.
Okay, thank you, David, for coming in there as well. I think in the interest of time, we'll have to move on to the next speaker, but there is another question for you, Daniel, on the Q&A, which I'll ask you to type an answer to. If you just click on the type answer button, a question about, well, comparing with investment in railways instead of HEV infrastructure from Edward Lee. Okay, so in the meantime, we will move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Emma Lawlor from the MRC Epidemiology Unit. And Emma, I would like to invite you to share your screen, and over to you.
Here we go. So thank you very much for having me. As you said, my name's Emma Lawlor and I'm from CEDAR in the MRC Epidemiology Unit. And as Jenna mentioned earlier on, so I was going to present some preliminary results of a systematic review and qualitative synthesis of stakeholder views on what works in implementing active travel infrastructure. So active travel is walking or cycling as an alternative to motorised transport for the purpose of making everyday journeys. Jenna already has nicely summarised some of the benefits of this, including about gaining physical activity, health, it's low cost and also requires little skills, can be easily incorporated in daily life and beneficial for the environment. Evidence suggests that changing the physical environment can encourage active travel, so the likes of introduction of bicycle lanes, improving the walkability of the area, and stakeholders have the ability and responsibility to implement these interventions. However, often making these changes, there's many challenges and barriers along the way, and there's lots of uncertainties on how to successfully actually navigate these processes. Stakeholders who are involved in this process, they obviously have a wealth of experience and knowledge about the practicalities. However, no review has previously synthesized their experiences and identified any generalizable lessons. So the aim of this review was to explore stakeholders' views and experiences of developing guidance for, designing, commissioning and implementing changes to the external physical environment that would have the potential to promote active travel. So studies that we were eligible for inclusion in our review. So participants, they needed to have direct experience of being involved in this process. So we had a very broad criteria, so ranging from the likes of politicians, town planners, civil servants and community members as well. Interventions, so it was any change in the physical or built environment that influenced walking and cycling behaviour, regardless if it had any sort of health impact, and it could be of any scale, so ranging from the likes of a bicycle lane to a whole new housing development, and we also included active travel policies as well. So for the outcomes, we are really interested in the views of the stakeholders. So it was qualitative data that we were looking for. So this was the likes of any interviews or focus groups. So any sort of primary data from themselves. And we didn't place any restrictions on the country or context or language. So we searched 8 electronic databases, and we also searched reference lists of articles and also contacted authors of studies that were included to try and identify studies for inclusion in this review, which brought back 20,384. So we ended up doing title and abstract screening for over 21,000 as well. And then this left us with 905 that we gained the full text for. So after reviewing these as well, we decided to tighten up our inclusion criteria slightly, because originally we had more of a broad focus on physical activity rather than active travel. So once we had done this, this reduced the number from 133 down to the 37 that we have included in our review. So the majority of the studies, they focused on walking and cycling, and they all used individual interviews and were supplemented by other different methods as well, and the majority were in developed countries. So from the thematic analysis of the qualitative data, there was 4 main overarching themes that we found. So firstly, it was about identifying the right people to actually bring about change. So people could be from a range of disciplines, from multiple levels of the decision-making process and from different time points of the process as well. So it included different political leaders, members of government, community representatives, community associations and advocacy groups and not-for-profit groups as well. So the key considerations in identifying these people was if they had the capacity to actually help, power to influence, if they had knowledge of the local area and also any active travel considerations or issues, if they were able to access and actually mobilize resources, if they were willing to have difficult conversations and risk any sort of opposition, and also have a personal interest in active travel, and often as well if they actually did it themselves. So the second main finding was about successfully initiating and maintaining collaborations. So the methods of communication to influence this was dependent on the different stakeholders. So communities, they often use political channels. So this was the likes of letters and petitions and attending public advisory committees, and also more complaint-driven approaches through the likes of complaint telephone lines and consultations as well. And these were found to be particularly effective if they needed little resources, such as improving broken lighting in an area. So decision makers, they engage with communities a lot by sort of educational promotional activities within the community, using media as well, and trying to do sort of innovative things such as walk and ride bike events. And advocates as well. So they would comment on council plans and also quite often would have advisory roles as well to the communities and also maybe any sort of councils or committees. And instead of working by themselves, they were best whenever they were in a formalized, organized group. So another finding was about fostering relationships. So many of the things I talked about there about communicating came into this as well. But a lot of it was to do about attendance actually within community events, such as at libraries, also involving the community within designing and the maintenance of the infrastructure, and just really ensuring that their views and voice were reflected in it. And also as well, the community and advocates could have a very important role in actually helping councils and governments in monitoring this infrastructure, such as reporting if there was any potholes or things that needed to be fixed. Sharing of evidence and knowledge was also key as well between different stakeholders. So the different disciplines and stakeholders, quite a few of them had different expectations of what was considered relevant. So some of them maybe preferred hard sort of statistics about cost effectiveness, and then others maybe if it worked out well before and if there was any precedence for it. There was a need to actually break down silos across different sectors and departments to be able to share this sort of information. Often required a very motivated, willing person to do this as well. And also as well that policymakers should be involved earlier in the research process to ensure that their expertise is used. So making persuasive arguments is obviously very important into actually getting the infrastructure in the first place being implemented. So quite often this is about how actually you frame the evidence, was able to gain the support of different stakeholders. So very commonly the economic benefits came across strongly. So this is the likes of improving the prosperity of the area, supporting local businesses, how it will support tourism, and also as well developers especially liked about how it could raise property prices also. Following this as well about having clear links to health was used. Environmental benefits was lesser discussed, and many of the studies kind of said that it could be maybe a hard sell to certain groups that really weren't interested in beforehand, and that economic co-benefits probably was the best approach to take. It was also key as well to make sure any of the persuasive arguments that you're trying to make align with the priorities of the stakeholders as well. and also using a combination of personal stories and narratives to illuminate the problems, and also some quantitative data, such as any sort of cost-benefit analysis, really worked well. And also as well, they appreciated using evidence from other contexts, such as things maybe that would happen in other countries that have been very, very successful and could be translated in the local area. So the next main key finding was about securing and maintaining resources. So funding was obviously very important, and what came through strongly, it was about the need for collaborations with organisations. So this could help for pulling resources and skills, pulling money, opening up new channels for funding as well. There's also, they often maybe use multiple different funding sources to fund just one piece of infrastructure if they couldn't get enough through one means. Also as well, some of the larger community organisations were able to gain money from about memberships and holding events in the communities. So the actors as well, so the key stakeholders, they also needed support also. So this included educational opportunities such as training courses or conferences, and also helping them to build their resilience if there was any opposition. It was also important as well, many said, about including active travel in the actual vocational courses so that in the future the stakeholders are aware of it and it's not new to them. And also as well for the communities to try and empower them through the likes of bike repair lessons and also education. And as well, quite often there was maybe multiple different advocacy groups that had very similar aims. However, organising them and bringing them all together could strengthen their voice rather than them working alone. So there were some factors that influenced the choice of infrastructure as well that needed to be considered. So contextual factors. So this was, you needed to understand what the sort of demographic are in the area, such as maybe people with disabilities, older groups, also in socioeconomic sort of considerations to ensure that you don't widen inequalities whenever implementing the infrastructure. Also social cultural sort of considerations such as image of active travel, if there was any other policies in place, and also about the organisations to understand how the structures work and engage best. And also as well, if there was any sort of political will or support there. Also, there's a need to recognise and act on opportunities. So examples were about campaigns, piggybacking on already existing public work projects and plans, and also as well electoral cycles. And there's also though the need to for it to be the right time and have the right people in place. And piloting in other contexts. So as many people probably have seen, sort of the temporary infrastructure that's maybe come around with the likes of COVID as well. So kind of cheap and quickly implemented infrastructure could be used to trial out if it actually does work in the area, and maybe show the public also that it's maybe not quite as intrusive as what they previously thought, and can learn some lessons and scaling it up as well, and also able to use guidance and design from other contexts, especially if it's not as developed in the area you're working in. And also interventions can complement the infrastructure as well, such as to improve the public support or work as a package, such as improving the area and also the likes of bus tickets or educational opportunities, so anything that could help the implementation of this infrastructure. So in conclusion, there's a need to identify the right people in collaboration. Economic and health benefits are most persuasive, however, it must align with their priorities. Contextual factors are very important, and there's a need to act on opportunities and can learn from piloting infrastructure, and the soft interventions can complement the infrastructure. So I just wanted to highlight there's a protocol available as well, and thank you to everyone else who is involved in the project. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Emma, for an interesting presentation. So if anyone has any questions for Emma, please add them in the Q&A now, and then we can bring them up. In the meantime, I was just going to ask a question myself. So when you're looking at these these methods of encouraging active travel, do a lot of these studies also look at ways of combining the active travel modes with public transport modes? Like say that you know, for example, in the Cambridge example, for people traveling in to work from villages outside Cambridge, where it would encourage them to use a bike to get to a bus stop and then use a bus or something like that. Is that something people look at?
Yeah, well, in the likes of there was about looking at connectivity of streets and things like that. Like that was important when deciding where to choose infrastructure, if it connected to other train lines and things like that. So that did seem to be a main consideration in the stakeholders. None of the studies I included were more about the effectiveness or anything like that there as well. But it was definitely those sort of things. Multi-trip journeys were a consideration when implementing it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Right, if anyone has any more questions for Emma, then please put those in the Q&A, and then you can type answers to those, Emma, as they come up. In the meantime, then we'll move on to our next speaker for the program, which is André Neto-Bradley, also from the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative. So André, could I please invite you to share your screen, and
yep.
Over to you.
Yeah, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much. As Eric said, my name's André. I'm a PhD student in the CDT for Future Infrastructure and the Built Environment, and also part of the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative. So today I'm going to be talking to you about how spatial inequality and access to clean cooking in urban India manifests itself, looking at the effect of location and community, and we'll see how we can model this to better locate and contextualize inequality in residential clean energy transitions at a city scale. Now, as a side note, the more astute amongst you will quickly notice that I'm talking about a transition from biomass fuels to gas, which is a fossil fuel, but bear with me. The issues we look at and the model we develop are part of a bigger picture of facilitating and enabling a move from unsustainable and harmful use of biomass fuels towards cleaner energy services in the medium and longer term. So, there we go. And the problem behind access to clean cooking is a pressing one, because despite continued efforts to reduce use of solid biomass fuels in Indian homes, about 50% of households still rely on these fuels for some or all of their energy needs. And it's estimated that annually, there are about 600,000 deaths associated with the resulting indoor air pollution in India, a burden that falls disproportionately on women and children. Now, there's a clear and pressing need for residential clean cooking fuels, and there have been ambitious policies in recent years, but progress has sometimes been slow, and policies do not always have the effect of promoting sustained uptake of cleaner cooking fuels amongst the energy poor in India. So the challenge is that while many policies focus on subsidizing the costs and more recently the upfront costs, not all energy poor households are necessarily income poor, and nor will they follow the same path to clean energy use. For example, some households may have different expenditure priorities, prioritizing things like household improvements, appliances, or their children's education, and others might continue using biomass fuels along with their newer, cleaner, less polluting fuel. And so if there are different barriers, different paths, each with their own challenges and barriers to transition, a sort of one-size-fits-all solution to promote clean energy use is not going to work. And we need to understand how and why households do or don't use a particular fuel if we're to design appropriate strategies to address this. And so that's what we set out to do. We started by conducting field work in 5 South Indian cities, surveying households and holding follow-up interviews to understand some of these defining barriers and challenges, the how and why of people's energy use, if you will. And we identified different common types of households or pathways characterized by different types of barriers. And then some of these barriers were related to where you are. So for example, kerosene is an alternative cooking fuel that has in the past been commonly used for cooking. But as subsidies have been rolled back and availability has become less widespread, households have been forced to make a choice if their local shop no longer sold it. Some would sometimes turn to sort of local black market or informal vendors, and others might return to using some firewood for their cooking, depending on what was closer. It isn't just where in the city you are, but also what's around you that matters. So for example, households in non-notified slums, that is slum dwellers without sort of an informal settlement, without legal rights to their lands, often already have poor access to utilities and infrastructure to begin with. And they often can't access the subsidies that are available, even though they are meant for low-income households, because they require a bank account for them to be reimbursed. And on top of where you are and what's around you, energy use and fuel choices are also shaped by household practices and habits. So many households we spoke to talked about how they would change what they cook if they needed to save some money. So rice can be cooked quite frugally on a traditional wood stove, especially when compared to cooking bread on a gas flame. And so looking at this all together, we can see that a household's energy transition can be influenced by this interaction of a household and its practices and habits, its location, and its sort of local socioeconomic context. In our fieldwork, we had the luxury of relying on rich, detailed data that we collected ourselves. But this sort of work is resource intensive, and many cities in India have limited, if any, data on energy access and use by their lower income households. So we've been working on a modeling approach that could help local stakeholders identify potential inequalities in clean energy access across a city using publicly available data. Our approach models individual households, factoring in local socio-cultural context, households' habits, behaviors, and practices, and all this using publicly available data in a sort of micro-simulation, if you will. And so what sort of insights can we gain from a micro-simulation, this sort of simulated view of energy access across the city? And I'd like to show you a little bit of some model outputs for the city of Kochi, a city of a bit under 1 million people in the southern state of Kerala. The first thing is that obviously, much as we'd expect from our fieldwork, the uptake of gas as a cooking fuel does vary across the city, as shown here, with differences between wards and trends in spatial distribution. But more interestingly, by modeling the effects of local sociocultural context and spatial effects, we can estimate how wards within the city compare to one another and the city average. And this can be helpful to identify wards that might be at greater risk of lagging behind as a result of challenges or barriers to sustain clean cooking. For example, these highlighted households, these highlighted wards all have a lower level of gas uptake than the city average. And we'll come back to these in a moment, so bear them in mind. But as we saw through our fieldwork, energy transitions are not a clear-cut thing, and just because a household has access to gas does not mean that it's achieved a sustained transition. So for example, if we look at these two wards with slightly above average uptake of gas, we also see, if we have a look at their residual biomass use, that this is actually slightly higher than some of their neighboring wards as well. So for these households, or for households in these wards, the challenge isn't as much getting them to adopt gas or have access to gas, but ensuring that they reduce their ongoing reliance on biomass fuels. Now, by modeling across the city, we also get a sense of the bigger picture of socioeconomic and spatial inequality and how energy use relates to it. So if we take a look at some of those wards we'd highlighted on the previous slide, these were wards with low gas uptake, and they also have higher levels of continued reliance on biomass. We interestingly see that they also all have a higher proportion of households relying on income from what's called daily wage labor. So these are, so this is sort of an unskilled employment, slightly precarious employment that can make it difficult for households to save up for monthly payments of LP. So they buy the LPG as a canister, it's not coming piped. But our model also locates energy use and access within the city, which allows for further analysis and sort of context setting. So if we have a look at this ward in the Central Island in a bit more detail, in this ward, just below a naval base, by the main road, there's a large migrant labor community. Their living circumstances are somewhat informal, and many rely on wage labor for income. What's more, they're also physically cut off from most of the city, almost a 20-minute walk from the next nearest civilian neighborhood, at least. While they do have access to gas, reliance on less clean fuels is quite common. So use of biomass and kerosene alongside gas stoves or in place of gas stoves is fairly common. Now, the model alone is not a decision-making tool, but it can help highlight issues such as these and start a discussion on interventions and strategies that is somewhat more cognizant of the views of the marginalized by estimating spatial distribution of differences in clean energy access. And whenever we work with data and models, it can be really tempting to get sucked in to the trends and patterns and all the numbers, but it's really important to remember that behind every data point, there's a story. And so we should always ask how we can leverage our models and data to help bring these stories to the fore. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now. Otherwise, you can always get in touch via email or that bastion of intellectual discussion that is Twitter. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, André, for a really great presentation. And if anyone has any questions for André, then please answer them in the Q&A now, or as André said, get in touch. Oh, that's my timer going off there, so you were perfectly on time as well. I was going to ask myself, so you gave some examples there of, was it Kochi and Kerala? So did you look at other cities in India as well, I presume, and how did the results compare between the different cities?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So we did actually look at a few different cities so we actually looked at some of those cities in South India that we'd also done fieldwork in, so we had a few data points to compare the model results to. We found similar patterns in across all of the cities. The challenge is that obviously in a bigger city, sort of cities such as Bangalore, which sort of has 10 million people, the density of population within the wards does make analysis a little bit trickier because you just have, that your level of aggregation is higher. But certainly for these sort of medium-sized cities around the million people mark, we found similar patterns, and the model was sort of able to pick them out quite well.
Okay, interesting. One maybe quick question. I was also interested. So, I mean, you pointed out right at the start of your presentation that this is obviously talking about a transition from biomass to gas. But do you think that there is an opportunity here for people to skip gas entirely and go straight from biomass to renewables, or is that quite hard in this situation?
This is another really interesting question. There's actually a recent, maybe a year and a bit ago, there was an interesting paper sort of talking about India's energy policy, where, at least for households, where there's this trade-off between the carbon reduction goals and the health problem. So it'd be tempting to sort of skip straight to using electricity and electricity that's from renewables, but there isn't, the electricity infrastructure required for it, and the supply of electric stoves isn't there yet to make that happen. Whereas with gas, it's a bit more feasible to make it sort of happen immediately, and so immediately reduce those deaths from indoor air pollution, and sort of in the more medium term work to sort of find the next step. But yeah, it definitely is a case of prioritizing the health impact first, and then working towards sort of a lower carbon alternative in the future. Okay,
great. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. We're going to move on now to our final speaker today, which is Jess Forsdyke from the Structures Research Group in Engineering. So Jess, feel free to share your screen, and over to you.
Sorry, having problems with the mute button. Right. Yes, I'll try and be quite succinct because I'm aware of the time. But I'm going to speak to you today about, well, thank you for the introduction as well, by the way. Speak to you today about what's so hard about concrete. So yeah, as was said, my name is Jess, and I'm a researcher in the Concrete Infrastructure Research Group, which is another group. C6 office is just around the corner, but I'm not in C6. It's another group based in engineering, and that falls within the structures group. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basically what the challenges are in terms of concrete and emissions, and obviously hopefully it's a bit different to what we've heard so far, but still cities related, because so much of our cities is made of this material. So there we go. So first of all, I'm sure lots of you are thinking, why on earth would anyone be interested in concrete? So I'm hopefully going to change your minds a little bit about this in the next 5 to 10 minutes. And convince you that it is a bit more interesting and actually definitely presents a climate issue. So you may or may not know, but concrete is made of 3 key ingredients. So we do often hear the words cement and concrete interchangeably used, which really grinds my gears, but is something that that sort of society doesn't necessarily differentiate. What cement is in concrete, but there are also other parts. It consists of water and aggregates, and we split the aggregates into fine aggregates or sand and coarse aggregates or gravel. And these 4 things get mixed together in some proportion to form fresh slate concrete or wet concrete, which we pour over reinforcement, and that gives us hardened slate reinforced concrete. You can see there, you know, standard car park or office block building that's made of it, or at the bottom is the example of the sort of thing that we do in my lab, which is to make smaller samples of the stuff and see how it performs. So, so that we can apply it to a particular application later. So the particular properties of that concrete, so like the strength or how stiff it is, are determined by the ratios of those 4 ingredients. And it's sort of similar. We always use the analogy of kind of how much egg you put in a cake batter is going to change the consistency of the cake at the end. But for a typical concrete, let's say you have about 15% cement and the other constituents making up the rest of the mix. But the problem we have and the emissions source is this cement. So when we multiply the proportions, back one, in the mix by their relative embodied carbon for each ingredient, you end up seeing that almost all of the emissions from concrete are from the cement content, even though that cement content is typically only around 10 to 20%. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about cement, now that we know that it's something that is not the same as concrete. So cement is this gray powder. Sometimes it's white, but it's normally gray, which comes in big bags like the one you see on the right there. That we use a lot of, but globally we use a lot of. So we'll talk a bit about more about that in a second. It is 95 to 100% made of this stuff called clinker. We'll talk about clinker production in a second. It sometimes has the name quicklime, but has absolutely nothing to do with the fruit. So don't be misled by that name. It's a little bit of chemistry. Now I'm trying to keep it simple, but cement is manufactured from limestone. We basically heat it to about 1500 degrees in a kiln. And obviously that is one of the big sources of the emissions. So the heating to 1500 degrees usually comes from direct combustion and is therefore a big cause of emissions. However, we've also got a chemical release of CO2, which means that overall, even if we can completely decarbonize the grid, power this chemical reaction completely sustainably, we're still going to have around 50% of the CO2 emissions that are associated with cement production being completely unavoidable. And, you know, technology as to what we do with that is really kicking off at the moment. So overall, this is totals about 5 to 8% of global CO2 emissions from the cement industry alone. So that's why the work that my group is doing is hopefully quite relevant. And that is about 2.2 to 2.5 billion tons of CO2. Obviously, it depends whose numbers you use. With the emissions accounting, can get quite fiddly. And for scale, that is about 2.5 times the emissions from all of commercial aviation globally every year. So the industry as a whole is a huge emitter, and it's something that we really need to try and challenge. Now, on this plot, you can see that we're trying to explain where these emissions go from. That actually, if we look at concrete compared to all of the other typical construction materials, so steel, aluminium, it's a pretty good performer. It actually does pretty well at a tiny, compared to aluminium in particular, emissions per kilogram. The problem comes from the amount that we use. So we use 25 billion tons of concrete every single year. Now that is equivalent to 3 tons per person alive on Earth. And if you aren't sure what 3 tons looks like, it's the weight of 2 walruses. So every single human being, we go through that much concrete every single year, year after year. And it means that it is the most heavily consumed material, second only to water in the world. So it's pretty intense. And the result is that although concrete is pretty good in terms of its carbon efficiency, as we saw before, it's very good, particularly compared to steel, things like this. We also use so much of it that overall carbon emissions to material are pretty high, and that's where we get the 5 to 8% from of global emissions. And so it gets quite a lot of bad press. You can see there's one of the headlines, the concrete conundrum. So what do we do? And this is kind of where my research group is looking into. But the only way really to reduce the emissions because of this unavoidable chemical release of CO2 is to actually just cut down on the amount of cement that we use in concrete and the amount of concrete we use overall. But we still need to build cities. So we can reduce cement use by using cement replacements in concrete. Sort of 3 main ways really. Using cement more efficiently within concrete and improving the durability of new and existing structures. I'm just going to really briefly talk about those because I'm conscious of time. So cement replacements are basically just materials that we can use to substitute for some, but not all of the cement in the concrete. These are great, and they were 20 years ago seen as the solution. The problem is they're usually waste products of other industries. So for example, granulated blast furnace slag comes from iron production, and pulverized fuel ash comes from coal combustion. Both of these processes are really carbon intensive. And it's great that we're using the byproduct, but we're phasing them out. So they can't last forever as a solution. So the solution that we're looking at more towards now is just generally improving cement efficiency. So we improve cement efficiency by carefully selecting our concrete mixes. So that means playing with the ratios that we saw earlier in the pie chart, depending on the performance requirements of the concrete, to see that we can minimize the cement content and add cement replacements where possible, but it's not always possible. It's already pretty common practice that you use a different concrete in a different place, wherever it's most useful. And so the next stage really is to say, well, let's do this on an even bigger scale and say, you know, where before we'd say we have 1 concrete for the walls, 1 concrete for the floors. Now let's say, well, we've got 1 concrete for only the parts of the walls that are actually under load, and another concrete for only the parts of the walls that are not stressed, and therefore it's just acting as infill. It doesn't need to be as strong, doesn't need to have as much cement in it. And that basically comes to ethos for the research that the Concrete Infrastructure Research Group is doing. And we're hoping that eventually it can be combined with efficient geometry and structural layout to basically minimize over-design and redundancy in structures so that we can continue to build new buildings with much less cement intensity. And finally, the last way that I've sort of mentioned that we can reduce cement consumption is to improve the durability of structures. They don't need to be replaced as frequently. And you can see the Google definition there of durability is to withstand wear, pressure, or damage. So this property defines basically how long something will last. And generally, if you put more cement into a concrete, it will last longer. But that has issues because cement, as we have seen, is really carbon intensive. So a potential solution instead is to look at comparing a low cement concrete, which has low durability and low embodied CO2, to a high cement concrete with high durability and high embodied CO2, and try and find a comfortable middle ground. And one way that we're looking into doing that is to essentially encase this low cement concrete, which forms the bulk of a material, with something of high cement content to protect it as a durability layer. And the challenges that this presents are basically, how do we do this with the manufacturing methods available at the moment, and what is going on in that interface between layer 1 and layer 2? And that's essentially what we're researching at the moment. So I think that is everything. If anyone has any questions, as André said, you can also find me on Twitter or send me an email. I haven't put my email up there, but I am JF580. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jess, for a really interesting presentation and for sticking to time as well. If anyone has any questions for Jess, then we've still got a minute or two if you want to ask those now. It's interesting. I was just thinking that the topic of concrete or cement has come up in multiple of these symposia that we've been organising with different aspects to it. So it's clearly like such an important part of the whole question. It keeps coming back from different angles, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think because concrete is one of those construction materials that is pretty much geographically available anywhere. You can always find sand, you can always find limestone to make cement, you can always find water. And because therefore it's so useful and we depend on it so much, but it has this unavoidable emissions, it is one of the hot topics for sure at the moment. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll hear lots more about it and hear lots more about your research. Oh, I think I've just seen a question come in from Ethna, who's asking, is there a hierarchy for situation to avoid use entirely in certain situations? I'm not quite sure what you mean with hierarchy here, but are there ways of avoiding use of cement entirely in certain situations?
I mean, the best case is to not have to tear down an existing building. So that would avoid use of cement entirely. And that is something that is also hugely under research here and in other institutions, is looking at kind of how can we best use what's there rather than replacing it. And that's also kind of hopefully where my research goes in terms of durability, because if we build something now that's going to last a lot longer and just doesn't have as much cement in it, then you're hopefully saving future cement as well as current cement. In other cases, I mean, I actually should have kept my sharing, but if we think about the emissions from other construction materials, it's all just an optimization really. So it might be that, yes, I want to try and use steel instead, but the steel is not always actually a better emission option.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we'll have to leave it there. Because we're already coming to the end of our time slot here. I'm just going to very quickly still bring up my slide, which shows the events coming up next week. So just to remind everyone that we have our Carbon Drawdown and Climate Repair Symposium next Wednesday, 10th of March. So please do come along and join that. And there are various other events happening next week as well, including the first of the Climate Change Lecture Series and the next installment of the Energy Transition Discussion Series on photovoltaics. So please do sign up for all those events. And then later in March, we've got the Cambridge Festival coming up as well. So lots going on. And we will be sending out all these links to everyone who signed up for today's event as well, so you can catch up on anything you've missed. And we will be sending out the link to this recording as well on YouTube, so you can follow up on anything that you may have missed. So with that, I would like to end today's session and just thank all our speakers for some great presentations. It was great to have this variety of topics addressing transport, cities and infrastructure. And also thanks to all the attendees who joined us today. And I hope you can join us for our next symposium next week. And that's it, I think, from me. So thank you all very much and have a good evening. Bye.